Good evening, everyone. Just give a few minutes as usual as people log in and find their way through the nest of technology in Zoom or YouTube. For those whom I haven't seen or heard from since 2021 began, Happy New Year. Just looks like some people are having a little difficulty getting through the waiting room. So we'll just give it another minute to see if they can sort out the technology. Good evening, Roberta. Looks like Jennifer's having some trouble in the waiting room.
Good evening, Rabbi. How are you?
Doing great, doing great. There we go. All right, so I think that the people who were trying to come are here, and we'll go ahead and get started. Anyone else who shows up, we'll just have to pick up wherever we are, and they can always go back and review the recording if they want to see what they missed. Happy 2021 to everyone. We are going to continue where we left off back last year in the history of the state of Israel, or as we say in Hebrew, Medinat Yisrael. As I pointed out last time, this is only the history of the modern nation state of Israel. This is not meant to be a comprehensive history of all of Jewish history or even the history of the land of Israel, which had many thousands of years not being an actual state of the Jewish people, although Jewish people always lived there. Instead, we're going to pick up in 1948 where we left off. You may remember that in 1948 and for months afterwards, Israel was fighting a war, the War of its Independence, that was perpetrated by the combined armies of the Arab nations that surrounded it in order to try and destroy the new state. This is despite it having been established according to full UN recognition and despite it having the support and recognition of most of the other nations of the world who acknowledge the new state of Israel as being appropriate and correct according to the UN system. The war eventually comes to a conclusion, as we talked about last time, and Israel occupies a territory that is now quite familiar, which does not include the territory that is usually referred to as the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, but instead is the remainder of the territory. This is sometimes called the Armistice Line, because technically Israel was not able to make peace with her enemies, but instead the nations that surrounded her simply agreed to a ceasefire, which lasted in quotes, decades. And so that line is often called the Armistice Line. It's often called the 48 borders, not exactly accurate. It'll also sometimes be called the 67 borders, because these are the borders that Israel will have up until 1967, which we will talk about later on. So if you hear these terms referred to, you'll know that they are referring to that shape of Israel with the West Bank and Gaza Strip removed from its overall territory. I think I did point out last time, but it bears repeating. The West Bank was then absorbed by Jordan and claimed as Jordanian territory, and the Gaza Strip likewise was occupied by Egypt. This could have been an opportunity right there to create a state for those Arabs who had been living in that area, what are now called Palestinians, as an exclusive term. Prior to 48, the term Palestinian did not refer to a particular ethnicity or a particular political identity. It merely meant people who happened to live in the area that was commonly referred to as Palestine and had been referred to as Palestine since the Romans renamed it that. So there could have been a Palestinian state right at that time. There could have been that Arab state that the UN had agreed to set up, but it was the Arab states of Jordan and Egypt that prevented that from happening after the war finally finished and they learned that they were not going to destroy the Israelis. So this creates what we are now familiar with, known as the Palestinian refugee issue, where the Palestinians living in those territories were not allowed to develop their own states, nor were they developed by the states that occupied them. Jordan did not invest heavily in infrastructure in the West Bank, nor did Egypt in the Gaza Strip. Similarly, they were not usually given the full rights and privileges. On top of this, there were also many hundreds of thousands of people who would later become identified as Palestinians who had left the land of Israel itself, the 48 borders, the armistice line, anticipating that after the war and the destruction of Israel, they would be able to return to the land. When it turned out that didn't happen, they were sort of stuck. I have to point out, because it is so often misunderstood, those Arabs and non-Jews who stayed within the borders of Israel and were there as citizens after the end of the war were given full citizenship rights by the state of Israel. They have Israeli passports, they vote in Israeli elections, they hold Israeli offices, both within the legislature, within the judiciary. They are members of the police force, the medical staff. They are equal citizens. Are there social discrepancies? Of course. The same way that there are discrepancies in the US or any other country between different social groupings. Yes, there are differences, and are sometimes those problematic? Also, yes. But they are problematic within the framework of being equal citizens. They are not separate. They are participants to their own desire within the Israeli life. Those who left, on the other hand, were not allowed to return during the armistice agreement. And so those hundreds of thousands, and now their descendants, have formed the bulk of what are called the Palestinian refugees, who are treated quite uniquely. Because if we look at our little bit of a census here, we can see that for Jews as well, there was a refugee crisis beginning after 1948. I'd already explained how Israel had attracted many hundreds of thousands of refugees from World War II before 1948. But after 1948, Israel had a new problem to contend with. In 1948, you can see in the central column, this is the Jewish population of the various countries or territories. And you can see the summation for North Africa and Arab countries and the non-Arab, but still usually Muslim countries as well. Those are the census numbers for the Jews in those countries in 1948, prior to the establishment of Israel. By 1972, you can see that the numbers have gone down catastrophically. That is not because all the Jews living in those countries were suddenly filled with Zionist zeal. Some certainly were, but for the most part, those Jews were driven out of those countries. Anywhere from 750,000 to 1 million Jews, depending upon different estimates, were forced out within the first couple decades of Israel's existence. And the vast majority of those ended up in Israel, since many other countries were not very welcoming. So right after the war had finished and Israel was just getting its feet under it and starting up its whole life and future, they were forced to absorb as many people as had just left on the Palestinian side. They were absorbed very quickly in many ways, and this is one of the great accomplishments of Israel, that they were able to take in so many immigrants from not only Europe, which had been expected, but also from the Middle Eastern countries where they were being persecuted and driven out, oftentimes without even being allowed to take their own bank accounts or other wealth with them. So they would arrive in Israel completely broke. But Israel found ways to build houses for them, to make them parts of the society, to get them job training, to teach them Hebrew as a conversational language in the modern form, and build them into the society. These are the forgotten refugees, that when people talk about the refugee problem of 1948, people forget that there were two major dislocations. There were those Arabs who left Israel in anticipation of the war, and there were those Jews who were forced to leave because the Arab countries were quite frankly, sore losers. But thankfully, they were at least allowed to leave, and that did become a blessing to Israel by greatly increasing its population and greatly diversifying the Jewish culture that was found in its borders. The different Jewish cultures around the world are generally defined in three categories: Ashkenazim, Sephardim, and Mizrahim, or Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and Mizrahi. The Ashkenazim are the Jews that generally come from Europe. Think Jews that have their background in England, France, or Germany, Poland, Russia, Romania, and the other Eastern European countries. Think of Sephardim as being the Jews who are descended either directly or culturally from the refugees of the Spanish Inquisition around 1492, when those Jews left Spain in large number and settled across North Africa and parts of the Middle East. And Mizrahi are the Jews who are more long-term residents of the Middle East and who were not as heavily influenced by the Sephardic, by the Spanish refugees during the 15th and 16th century. So these three cultural divisions of Jews have existed for a very long time, and each have many cultural markers: clothing they wear, food they eat, slight variations in prayer that are found in different communities, the kind of things that you would normally expect between different cultures, the same way that you can find differences between British English speakers and Australian British speakers and South African and English speakers in the United States and Canada. You can also find differences among these three different Jewish branches. By and large, the Zionist endeavor was being pushed in the 19th and early 20th century by the Ashkenazim, by the European group. That group were the most active, the ones who had been lobbying, the ones who had been working with the world powers to try and get approval through the United Nations for the settlement. They were the main driving force for the establishment of the state in 1948, and they were the bulk of the population. They were added to the smaller Sephardic and Mizrahic communities that were already in Israel at that time, but they quickly outnumbered them during the different waves of aliyot that we talked about in our last session. The Sephardic and Mizrahi tended to be viewed as a lump by the Ashkenazim, by the Europeans. And unfortunately, they were not always viewed fondly. They were often viewed as being antiquated in a positive way of, aren't they quaint? Isn't it nice the way they're wearing turbans? Isn't it nice the way they wear robes like Arabs do? We need to modernize them. Or occasionally viewed as being barbaric. After all, many of the Mizrahi groups were still practicing polygamy. And of course, most of them were not as refined in European cultural markers. They didn't enjoy opera and the symphony, for example, the way the Ashkenazic did. And this created tension. The Ashkenazim were often patronizing. We know best, we're more educated, we will bring you into the future. we have gone through the Enlightenment, through the Haskalah, and we will bring you up as well. And often they were also just outright racist. We will eventually help our brothers and sisters of the darker complexion, but we shouldn't expect too much for them. After all, they've been immersed in Arab culture, they've been immersed in backwards communities, and we'll take care of them because they're not capable of that themselves. This led to decades of resentment and problems. Now, it was not institutionalized. This was not something that was built into the fabric of Israeli law. This is not something that was an official policy. However, the biases and tendencies of many of the early leaders who were Ashkenazic did continue to make this problem a real problem for many decades when it should not have been. They definitely, the Ashkenazi leaders definitely did work to provide education, jobs, and all the other things you would hope for other citizens. But in their personal attitude, there were sometimes, there were often very unpleasant attitudes. There was an attitude often that if an Ashkenazic boy married a Sephardic or Mizrahi girl, that basically that was an intermarriage, that they were marrying outside of the group. This has mostly died down in the modern time. You do find a little bit of it still hanging around in some people's attitudes, but there was a large upheaval in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that has done a good share of getting rid of this. That plus the continued warfare where people fought side by side against common enemies does tend to erase a lot of the resentment that people can feel one to another. So let's go ahead and take a look. Take a look at what that early state looked like politically, now that we have an idea of what it looked like demographically. So politically, Israel was a socialist state. Now, the word socialism and socialist means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but I'm using this in the actual technical meaning of the word, not in the political rhetoric of people who don't know what the word means. What I mean is that the government was the major contributor and controller of the means of production. It was not communist in the sense that there was no attempt to dissolve the entire government or entire society into a collective of workers, but the government was very heavy-handed in how it controlled the industries and financial system of the early state. Even up till 1970, as much as 70% of the population worked either directly as a government employee in one form or another, whether it be, as you might expect, in a government office or in a government-run industry, or indirectly serving as contractors and laborers for government projects and government businesses, where they still were basically drawing their support from the government economy. This also provided a huge safety net. Israel has provided very generous unemployment insurance, very generous welfare packages, very generous poverty support and training and educational programs, very generous healthcare. So it had all the hallmarks of what you would consider a European socialist country. If you want to think of modern examples, think of places like Denmark, that still have a very similar style of government and economy. Now, in the 80s, this changed. In the 80s, they had their own version of the privatization revolution, similar to what happened in England under Margaret Thatcher. And this moved the economy much more into the private sphere, much more into a more mixed market economy, but more heavily towards a capitalist balance. However, Israel does still have universal health care. It still has pensions for the elderly, similar to our Social Security, but generally more generous. It still has child assistance, and it still has many other forms of social welfare. So although the economic side of the early socialist state has mostly disappeared in large part, the social side of the socialist beginnings is still there in very large measure. Questions or comments on this side of Israeli history, their economy and demography? Okay. I will then jump us into their politics. So we are all still reeling from the political upheaval that's happened, came to a flashpoint yesterday, but it's been going on for quite a few years in the United States. In Israel, although they have not had a violent clash like we saw yesterday, they have nevertheless had a system of government that has been stable for some times and very unstable at other times. Unlike the United States, Israel does not have a formal constitution. It's a long story of how it missed that window of opportunity. It did intend to have a constitution when it was founded. It just kind of got thrown into the war, and the people who were busy governing during the war sort of never ended up making a constitution. Again, that's a whole nother conversation of how that played out. This means, however, that Israel has changed the way it has constituted its government quite a few times. For most of its history, it has been a parliamentary democracy, which is what it is now. But it has also had a direct elected president at other times that had more executive power than the current president office in Israel, which is at the moment more of a figurehead. So the way it works now, because we're not going to go through the entire history of how this has changed over the decades, is that Israel has a Knesset, a parliament, and in the parliament there are 120 seats. Those seats are apportioned to different political parties. Unlike the United States, where you vote in our national government, for example, for your local representative. For example, I live in the congressional district currently represented by Stephanie Murphy. If you live in another part of the US, you'll be voting for a different person. In Israel, you don't vote for a district representative. You vote for a party. It would be the functional equivalent for my American viewers of saying you go to the polls and you vote Republican. Not you choose the Republicans, you vote Republican. And then if the Republicans win 30% of the seats, 30% of the vote, they will get 30% of the 120 seats. That is to say, they'll get about 40 seats. That is something that has made it so that Israel has always had a very diverse political landscape. Unlike the stability, stagnation, depending upon your point of view, of the American two-party system, Israel has had multi-parties for many, many years, since its beginning, really, because even a very small group of people, I believe the current threshold is 4.5%. That's something that's continued to change. So please forgive me if I'm wrong in 2021 of what the current level is. But let's just say around 5%. If you get 5% of the vote, you're going to get at least one seat in the final Knesset, in the final government. That means that there is an advantage to having your own sub-party that advocates for a particular set of policies rather than being in a larger umbrella group. If you have a majority, 61 seats or more, then that majority can choose who will be the prime minister, which functionally is similar to the president in the United States in the sense that the prime minister is the chief executive. However, unlike the prime minister, unlike the president of the United States, and unlike the representatives of the United States, if the government, meaning all the members of the parliament, decide to no longer support the prime minister can be fired. And at that point, usually, there will be a new election, unless someone else could succeed the prime minister at that time in forming a majority. Because usually what happens, in recent history especially, is no single party has been able to get 61 seats. And therefore, all of the political governments of Israel for the last 40 years, at least, have been formed, give or take unity government, but that's sort of special, have been formed by having multiple parties agree to work together to appoint a prime minister that they all can get behind. But that means there is a lot of wheeling and dealing, meaning that people will work together. So you'll have the ultra-Orthodox parties working together with the right-wing party, working together with a more libertarian type party in order to each get what they want from the government. And if any one of those groups feels that they're not being served, that they're not getting enough from the government, they could withdraw their support at any moment. And if they do so, and no one else steps in to fill the gap in the majority, then you can have a new election. And indeed, Israel has been going through a cycle of elections over the last few years that is dizzying. And they had been going through a set of multiple elections in the year right before COVID-19 hit. It settled down with the building of a coalition to deal with the pandemic. But even though the pandemic is still a problem in Israel, that coalition has fallen apart. And it looks like elections are imminent. So do not be surprised if there is a new set of elections in Israel in the next few months. And then we'll have to see whether the parties that are given their apportioned seats will be able to form a coalition. Because for multiple times prior to the COVID-19 coalition, there were elections and nobody could agree on a prime minister. And so they had new elections. And no one could agree on a prime minister. So they had, well, you get the picture. Unfortunately, that is a very real possibility again in the coming election. Although at the moment, it looks like many of the parties are in flux and many of the politicians are switching allegiances. So who knows? If you are somebody who loves a very vibrant and ever-changing political landscape, follow Israeli politics and you'll never be bored because there is always something going on, and the chance for a new election and new alliances and new deals is always very high. However, this does sometimes make it a little hard to govern. But that's, again, a discussion for another time. Any questions on that basic political structure for Israel? All right, so let's get to what usually is the focus of the history of Israel from 48 to the modern day, which is the wars. Israel has had to fight multiple wars and multiple warlike situations since 1948. Although you might have thought since 48 was such a victory for Israel that no one would want to fight Israel again, it turns out that that's not the case. And in fact, immediately after the armistice, there were already continuing violence along the border between Israel and her neighbors. The Egyptians and Jordanians in particular would continue to fire into, taking potshots or even worse, at citizens within Israel. And Egypt especially was continuing to escalate from 51 onwards of sending in armed groups, raiders, if you will, that would come across the long border along the Sinai Peninsula to do damage into the land, into the country of Israel. Also, during the early 50s, Nasser became the leader of Egypt, and Nasser was a revolutionary in his own way who wanted to kick the Europeans completely out of Egypt. So he nationalized the Suez Canal, formally taking it away from the European powers, specifically France and England, who had been in control of the canal zone. Nasser also wanted to increase the might of Egypt vis-a-vis its comparison to Israel, and so became a strong client state of the major arms exporters at the time, and was trying to build up that military. Nasser was very much hoping to become the head of an Arab coalition that would span across the Middle East, a new caliphate, if you will, although at the time it did not have the same religious overtones. It's important to understand that at this time, the fights were primarily political fights, although definitely there were many religious leaders who were opposed to Israel on their religious grounds. By and large, most of the Arab nations were upset about the establishment of the State of Israel and its continued existence as a symbol of colonialism, not as a Muslim versus Jewish stress. So Nasser was a political leader. He was not a religious visionary. This is not the Iranian Revolution. This is a more political revolution. So during this time, Israel is facing increased hostility, violence, and also is being denied use of the Suez Canal, which is a major problem and also considered to be an act of war when you close off an internationally recognized waterway. And so Israel, with the prompting and really instigation of England and France, decided to invade. Now, I say decide because ultimately it was Israel's choice. However, it's important to understand that Israel was being supported militarily by England and France at this time. The United States did not want to touch Israel with a 10-foot pole, although Israel and the US have been very close in recent decades. It's really important to remember that originally the US, although voting for the establishment and recognizing Israel's right to exist, was not a major supporter of Israel in its day-to-day struggles. However, France and England were more than happy to sell, not give, sell the military hardware that Israel needed in order to maintain its defense. And there were many threats between the British and French and Israel that if Israel did not put the canal into jeopardy, that they would cut off their arms shipments. Why would England and France want the canal to be in jeopardy? This was a ploy. What they were hoping was that with the canal in jeopardy, that the international world would say, oh no, the Suez Canal is too important to be allowed to be in this war zone. We need to put the Europeans back in charge of it. We need to put them back in, stop Nasser, and then we can allow this to proceed. And so Israel was essentially their attempt to create a crisis that they would then be able to solve. It did not work out the way they wanted, although Israel's attack was very successful. The United States decided that it did not approve of this at all and forced Israel to withdraw, as well as the French and British to not reclaim the canal. And so after the 56, unfortunately, things went back to the status quo, which meant that Israel continued to be harassed across its Sinai border by the Egyptians. And at the same time, as we move forward another decade, Israel has continued to be harassed by the Jordanians and by the Syrians in the north. If you look at my map here on the right, this is a picture of the northern part of Israel, the Sea of Galilee, known as Yam Kinneret in the north. And over here is the Galil, or the Galilee, which is in Israel. And in 1967, we have the Golan Heights in the hands of Syria. As you can see, the elevation difference is staggering. And the artillery of the Syrians would stay perched in the Golan Heights and would bombard the different communities that lived in this northern area of Israel, and would do so with relative impunity, since there was no easy way to scale the Golan Heights to retaliate, and it was technically in another country at the time. So Israel is now facing continued attacks from the Golan Heights, which is severely hurting the lives of the people who live in the north. Israel, like I mentioned, is still being attacked by Egypt across the Sinai border as well, and by Jordan across the West Bank border. And the other Arab nations are in the summer of 67 beginning to mobilize, beginning to put their armies into position in order to attack. It is clear that an attack is imminent, and it will be a joint attack by the Arab nations again, much like 1948, but with increased hardware and increased determination. At the same time, Egypt orders the United Nations peacekeeping troops to leave the Sinai Peninsula. Fairly clear that what's happening here is that Egypt is going to use the Sinai as its staging ground for its attack against Israel. Also at the same time, Egypt closes the Straits of Tiran which means that Israel will no longer be able to get oil delivered to it from Iran unless the oil wants to go all the way around the Horn of Africa. It's important to know that Iran was a Western ally during this time period. That was because the Americans and British had toppled their democracy back in the 50s and replaced it with the autocratic Shah. That's something that comes back to bite America and England later on with the Iranian Revolution. But at this time, Iran is an ally and is the major oil supplier of Israel. Jordan and Iraq join into the defense pact, and it is clear that war is imminent. So what happens? Israel decides that given all of the acts of war that have already been perpetrated upon it, that it is going to mobilize and strike with its army first. Make sure that's very clear. People often call the Six-Day War a preemptive attack or a sneak attack. There was nothing sneaky about that. It is the equivalent of two people that are having a pushing, shouting match in the parking lot, and they both have already hit one another. They both already touched one another, but one of them decides, as he sees the other guy reaching for his gun, that he is going to end it before the gun gets pulled on him. And Israel decides to smash the Arab armies before they can actually get underway. The Israeli Air Force performs an amazing number of attacks, absolutely decimating the Arab air forces on the runways. And then with control of the skies, Israel continues to destroy the Arab armor and artillery positions, providing cover for Israeli ground forces to sweep across the Arab countries and take more defensible positions. By the end of these 6 days, and yes, it really was only 6 days long from the moment Israel began its offensive, Israeli forces are within striking distance of Cairo, Damascus, and Amman, the capitals of the major countries that have been attacking. So when we look at the map, we can see that this is the area pre-67 that Israel controlled, again called the Armistice Border of 48. And by the end of the war of 6 days, Israel is now controlling in the north the Golan Heights, as you can see outlined there, and is controlling the West Bank territory up to the Jordan River, and is controlling the Sinai Peninsula all the way to the Suez Canal. Israel stops voluntarily at those borders. As I mentioned, Israel had the military capacity and it had the ability to go on to attack the major population centers of the countries that it had attacked it, but it was looking at this point more for achieving defensible borders and for achieving a position from which it could bargain for an end to hostilities. At the time that this happens, not only does Israel triple its landmass under its control, but it also adds in 750,000 Arab people, civilians. That is to say, the people who live in the Golan Heights, which was not a huge population, and the much larger population that lived in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the few that lived in the Sinai Peninsula, which has always been very sparsely populated, those get added to territory that Israel now controls. Now, Israel does not formally annex this territory at this time. Israel does not formally claim sovereignty over this territory at this time. And therefore, Israel does not extend citizenship or any other form of dominion over the people that live within this territory. Israel at this time does not have a plan for annexation or for absorption. Israel is looking for a way to stop the hostilities, a way to stop the attacks that have been continuing from the Golan Heights along the Jordanian border and especially along the Sinai border. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. That is to say, violence continues to come from the surrounding nations. Even though they have lost and even though another armistice has been agreed upon thanks to international support, the day-to-day violence continues to go against Israel, even with having had this resounding victory. Any questions up until the Six-Day War here? And by the way, there are entire books written about each of these wars and time periods in Israeli history. So please understand that I am only giving the most superficial outline of these events. Okay. So with with the hostilities continuing unabated, it is not surprised that there was going to be another major war, this time in 1973. It is usually called the Yom Kippur War because this war starts on Yom Kippur. The Arab armies undertook a very long period of building up their arms. They purchased, with a lot of oil money, the finest military equipment that was available to them from the Soviet Union, and really became more explicitly a client state of the Soviet Union. That is to say, they were now being supported by the USSR in their war against Israel. They also began to bring their armies up to readiness and then demobilize multiple times in the months leading up to the actual invasion on 73 as a way of draining off the Israeli readiness. If you see your opponents get ready and then not, and ready and then not, it makes it much harder to know when you should mobilize. And as Israel does have a primarily civilian military, where most of the armed forces are made up of reservists that are conducting their regular life, doing their regular businesses, you cannot mobilize your entire army constantly without destroying your ability to have an economy and society. So Israel was more hesitant and did not anticipate the attack that came on Yom Kippur. This was, by some measures, a missed intelligence operation. And thus, when the first hours of the war began to unfold, Israel was at a severe disadvantage along all of her fronts. And the additional Soviet technology also equalized the fight for the air, as the anti-aircraft missiles especially were very effective at the beginning of the war. And at the time, Israel, for the first few days, was in a very difficult position. She was pushed back along all of the fronts, and there were heroic efforts to try and stop and to stall until more people could be called up and brought to bear. And it was just enough. During this entire time, the international community was not helpful. That is to say, during the time Israel was on her back foot, the international community was not moving to stop the attacks that were coming from the Arab armies. Instead, Israel was fighting desperately and was worried that if they could not stem the tide, that they would be overrun. Remember, Israel is outnumbered by many, many tens to one in terms of population, and in many other military measures of actual soldiers, of tanks, of planes, of military hardware. Israel was in a very vulnerable position, but she did still have better training, she did still have a better defensible position, and she did still have better leadership. And so eventually Israel was able to fight back and to push back and to secure all of the borders that she had been holding prior to this attack in 73. So going back to the end of the Six-Day War borders. It was at this time that the United States eventually, and after much arm twisting, and really more as an attempt to prevent the Soviet Union from claiming victory, began to become a stronger supporter and arms supplier for Israel. And that was a very important factor in making sure that Israel could secure and fight itself back into victory. But it did come a little later than I think most Israelis certainly would have appreciated. So the 70s then turns into a time of soul searching. The jubilation that came after the Six-Day War has turned into hand-wringing and finger-pointing and a great deal of soul searching of where are we going? Are we going to just keep fighting major wars? Are we going to have to live like this for the rest of all time? Is this the society we want? At the same time of the huge loss of life and the huge financial cost that was taken from the wars, there were also economic issues going on. Israel, like the rest of the world, was facing the scourge of inflation during the 70s, brought about primarily by the OPEC crisis, which was engineered to harm not just Israel, but also the world that might support her. And this created an opportunity for a change in political leadership. The Labor Party, which had been in control of the Israeli government since 1948, was defeated by Likud, which is the main opposition party. And Likud, in addition to being more what we would call right-wing on many topics, was also much more of a proponent of free markets. Like I said, very similar to the Margaret Thatcher revolutions of the 80s that happened in England. So many of the government companies and operations were privatized. Currency trading, meaning of the shekel, was opened up, which allowed the shekel to find an equilibrium that was better suited for her imports and exports. And this helped pave the way for the tech boom that was there once the economy began to stabilize by the end of the 1980s. So lots of debate about whether or not it was the changes of Likud or whether it was just the general change of the global economy during the 80s that was responsible for this. But Israel did capitalize on the improving global economy greatly from the 80s onward. One of the other things, of course, that helped was that Israel has one of the highest per capita education rates of any place on earth. And so there are more PhDs per capita there than anywhere else. And this is one of the things that has made it very successful in a information technology-driven economy that is more interested in the ideas than just the manpower. Also, during the end of the 70s, there was an attempt put forward by Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who was the Likud prime minister at the time, to negotiate a peace with Anwar Sadat, who was the prime minister or president of Egypt at the time. And this was being, what's the right word, coordinated by President Carter, who was the president at that time as well. Eventually at Camp David, the American retreat for which the accords are named, there was a peace treaty signed. And unlike the earlier armistices, which were merely ceasefires, this was an actual peace treaty. This peace treaty said that Egypt would recognize Israel as a legitimate nation and that Israel would return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. So this is the original model of land for peace that created the détente between the two states. Their peace has not exactly been a loving affair since. However, it has endured many crises since 1978. And that is incredibly important. Egypt was always the largest military that Israel faced. It was always the most dangerous military that Israel faced. By having a peace treaty with Egypt, it allowed Israel to avoid any additional conventional wars until the present day. So Israel has gained 40 years of not having full-scale multi-enemy war for 40 years thanks to this peace treaty. So 40 years for giving up the Sinai Peninsula, many people would argue that was a pretty good trade. Of course, Egypt also had its part sweetened by the United States, as did Israel. Part of the agreement was that the United States would give money to both Egypt and Israel in particular, the money was there in order that Israel could maintain its military edge, so that as it gave up the buffer zone of the Sinai Peninsula, it would at least know that it had a military advantage should there ever be an attack again. One of the unfortunate truths that was shown from the 1973 Yom Kippur War was that even as large a piece of territory as the Sinai Peninsula did not provide an adequate strategic buffer for Israel. But instead, it seemed like its military superiority was its best defense. Unfortunately, Sadat, the Egyptian president who had negotiated, was assassinated by his own people for his part in this negotiation. Part of that was because the negotiation not only said that there would be peace between Egypt and Israel, but it also said that there should be a negotiated peace between Israel and the Palestinians, who were now having that as their separate national identity and who had begun a campaign of terror some years before. Unfortunately, the Palestinians were not interested in having that negotiation. And we'll talk about why as I flip to the next slide, but does anyone have any questions before I do? Okay. So the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was and continues to be the primary spokesperson for the Palestinian national aspirations, was created by the Arab League in 1964. This was to give a secular political voice to the anger felt by the people that now were identifying themselves by the title Palestinian as an identity, not merely a geographic location. Yasser Arafat was the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization until his death, and he organized 61 attacks just between the September-December time of 1967, between September and December in 1967. 1968 began campaigns of hijackings, which became very famous around the world. And this campaign of terror was set up to essentially weaken Israel's resolve until the country would be dismantled. It's very, very important, as we just saw from the discussion of the Camp David Accords. When peace was offered to be negotiated with the Palestinians, they were not interested in it because, unlike Egypt, who was reclaiming all of the territory they had lost, minus Gaza, which they didn't want, during the 1967 war, for the Palestinians to reclaim all the territory they wanted, they would need to take all of Israel. And since Israel was not willing to negotiate its own self-destruction, the Palestinians were not willing to come to the table either. And that meant that really until this day, you have a large proportion of their population, not all, but a large proportion, that essentially see as the final goal should be the destruction of the state of Israel. That it, as an institution, and the Jews who live there should either leave or die or be non-citizens of a Palestinian state. Obviously, Israel is not eager to arrange for such a thing. Terrorism, however, was not unique to the Palestinians. Hezbollah is a organization that was founded out of Lebanon, mostly as an auxiliary of Iran, which at this point had been radicalized by the Shia revolution against the Shah. And it was founded during the Lebanon War, which we'll talk about in a second. And then Hamas, which now is in control of the Gaza Strip, was founded in 1987 as a more radical and more explicitly Muslim version of the Palestinian aspirations. The PLO, as I said, was and still is mostly a secular organization, although certainly they pay lip service to Islam, but that was not their initial motivator. Hamas, on the other hand, explicitly embraces a radical Islamic ideology. So I mentioned the war in Lebanon. To understand how Israel got involved in the war in Lebanon, which is often called Israel's Vietnam, we have to see how the Palestinians ended up in Lebanon. So the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, tried to have a coup, tried to overthrow the country of Jordan in 1970, literally trying to take control of the nation. They lost. And the king of Jordan wasn't happy about someone trying to take over his country from him. And so he drove the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, out of his country. The PLO then needs a new location. It needs a new base of operations. So they move to Lebanon. And in Lebanon, they begin to attack Israel across the northern border. In 1975, thanks in part to the Palestinian Liberation Organization destabilization of Lebanon, Lebanon goes into a civil war. Until this time, Lebanon had been a fairly stable, for the region especially, multi-ethnic and multi-religious country that had a relatively decent standard of living. The Civil War puts an end to that. And during the process, the PLO gains more authority as there is now less to control it from a top-down government. And so as the PLO gets emboldened and begins to attack Israel more across the northern border, Israel sees no recourse since there is no legitimate and active overriding authority in Lebanon itself, thanks to the Civil War. Israel moves across the border in 78 in order to try and subdue the PLO and their terrorist operations. In 1982, it flares up again. Israel assaults again, this time sending its planes all the way up into Beirut, and the PLO at this point flees to Tunisia, which you may remember, Israel eventually has to strike them in Tunisia too, as an ongoing process of retaliation for the terrorism that they are perpetrating. Israel ends up staying in the southern part of Lebanon, basically from the border of Israel up to the Litani River, all the way up until into the early 2000s, until 2000. And one of the things you can understand is when you see the names of all of the Israeli towns and villages within miles, in some cases practically yards of the border, how easy it was for them to be attacked by the terrorists that were coming across the border. But eventually Israel is able to pull out. All right, I'm looking at my time and we're running late. Innovation nation, as I mentioned, Israel incredibly intelligent, incredibly productive, and is a very creative place. But we need to talk a little bit more about what happened since with the Palestinians. We had what was called the first Intifada, the first uprising, which began in 1987 and went to 1991 or 93, depending upon how you're counting. This was waves of violence in Israel itself, perpetrated by Palestinian terrorists. And there was a great deal of frustration that there had been no progress. Remember, at this point, the Palestinian Liberation Organization has been working for 20 years trying to destroy Israel. Israel is not being destroyed. In fact, it seems to still be growing and fairly healthy, despite the different attacks. So at this time, they begin to go into more of a street level terrorist attack. Rather than going for major bombings, it's more about shooting and murdering Israelis, causing more low-level violence, although it's certainly not low-level to the victims of it. But it creates an extreme level of bitterness and anger on both sides. As you can imagine, Israeli civilians do not take kindly to themselves and their children being murdered. And of course, the Palestinians do not take kindly to Israeli retaliations as they try to put a stop to or hunt down the perpetrators of these atrocities. Eventually, however, there is an attempt to bring a peace deal to the table. In 1993, under the auspices of the United States and the then President Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, sign an accord, and they establish a framework that will create peace. The Palestinians recognize Israel's right to exist. Israel recognizes the Palestinians have a legitimate right and political rights as well. And they establish a set of phased withdrawals of Israeli forces, and Israel begins to move back from territories in the West Bank. Eventually, Israel will also move back from territory of the Gaza Strip, which is now completely 100% under Palestinian rule, as this establishes a nascent Palestinian government. Unfortunately, for his part in this, Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated by a Jewish terrorist, much like Sadat was assassinated years before. And unfortunately as well, there's a Jordanian peace in 1994, very important, but we're going to sort of jump that. Unfortunately, eventually the Palestinians stall the discussion of the further negotiations, and instead they, in 2000, establish another intifada that lasts for about 5 years. This was punctuated by many bus bombings and other forms of terrorism. And it seems to have been done in order to try and force Israel to make greater concessions in the negotiation. Of course, instead, it only stiffens Israel's resolve, and Israel takes different steps rather than conceding in order to protect itself and eventually put an end to the violence, which leads us to the present day. As far as the Israeli-Palestinian situation is concerned, Israel is adamant that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. The Palestinians are adamant that any Palestinian who claims to have been living in the pre-1948 borders of Israel should be allowed to return and reclaim that territory. Now, these are directly in opposition. The attempt by the Palestinians is to swamp Israel with an influx of non-Jewish population, which would essentially destroy Israel as a Jewish state, changing the majority population to be non-Jewish, which would then be allowed to pass any laws they felt like that would persecute or remove the Jewish population. And of course, the Palestinians will not admit that Palestine is a Jewish state, because that means they would have to give up the dream of flooding into Israel and destroying it as an entity. Even on something as small but big as Jerusalem, a small area of territory, there is a great deal of disagreement about where a border would exist between the Palestinian and Israeli state. Also, those Israelis living over the Green Line, often referred to as settlers, who live in the disputed territory of the West Bank, the question of what their standing would be. Would they be evicted? Would they be amalgamated into Israel with land swaps being given to compensate to the Palestinian state? There has been no agreement on that. Also, exactly how much sovereignty and autonomy would the Palestinian state have? Would they be allowed to have their own army, their military? Would they be allowed to control their border access completely, thereby allowing them to bring in and arm themselves with whatever they felt like without Israeli checks? As you can see, that as a security issue would be very difficult for Israel to accept, given the current level of mistrust. And of course, Israel has its own members that are adamant that some or all of the West Bank should be annexed into Israel itself and become part of the official Israeli state. And they are unwilling to make any concessions that would prevent that. Which doesn't exactly leave us on a high note, I know. Unfortunately, this is where we get up to in the political state. Culturally and ethnically, Israel is a marvel. It has amazing art, literature, science. It has amazing culture of so many people from around the world. It is one of the most amazing places you can visit historically and also environmentally. And it has this sword of Damocles hanging over it, over a Gordian knot, if you will, to mix a few metaphors and allusions, of the current security situation. And although Israel is more physically secure at the moment, in the sense that terrorist attacks have dropped dramatically thanks to new steps and innovations in prevention, Israel still is experiencing the routine firing of rockets into its population centers, and the threat of many more thousands of rockets from the surrounding countries, in particular from Gaza and from Lebanon, from Hezbollah. And who knows what's going to come out of the Syrian civil war along its northern border. And on top of that, the ever-present acts of terrorism, most recently usually in the form of car rammings or knifings, is a threat that Israelis have to live with. And they do not want to. They would like to find a way to make peace. And the Israelis do consistently poll in their polls that they will work with a partner that is willing to discuss in good faith steps that could establish a secure peace for both parties. Unfortunately, at the present time, that does not seem to be forthcoming. So we will have to wait and see and pray and hope and advocate that Israel can be kept strong to defend itself, but also be given the strength and conditions to be able to make peace for itself as well. But that is something that hopefully will come soon, but there is no way to predict, just like there's no way to predict the next election in Israel either. Any questions or comments? And thank you for sticking around for the few extra minutes that we went over. All right, and I will remind you again, this is the biggest bird's eye view of Israeli history for the last 70 some years. So please, please, please go and learn more. There is so much more depth to all of this. It is a tiny country and a tiny modern history, but volumes can be written on any decade of its current run. So please go and learn more. Please continue to support Israel and its right to exist. When things are better and happier times, please try to make a chance to visit. But in the meantime, just marvel at the miracle that is the modern state of Israel. Take care, everyone, and be safe and healthy.
Thank you, Rabbi.